Fractured Minds, a deep dive into the American psyche. Beneath the veneer of American prosperity lies a staggering, invisible crisis. Millions of citizens are currently waging silent wars within the confines of their own minds, battling conditions that distort reality, cripple productivity, and shatter families. It is a systemic epidemic where biology meets environment, leaving no demographic untouched by the specter of psychological distress. From the bustling streets of Manhattan to the quiet plains of the Midwest, the statistics paint a harrowing portrait of a nation on the brink. We begin our investigation with the most pervasive shadow casting darkness over the modern world. Depression, major depressive disorder, the architecture of the abyss. To classify major depressive disorder, MDD, merely as a condition of sadness is a linguistic failure of catastrophic proportions. It is akin to describing a hurricane as a breeze or a famine as a skipped meal. In the clinical and sociological landscape of the United States, MDD stands as the leviathan of mental health pathology, a pervasive, crushing force that dismantles the very machinery of the self. It is the leading cause of disability in the U.S. for ages 15 to 44.4, a statistic that represents not just a medical crisis, but a profound economic and cultural hemorrhage. This disorder does not simply lower one's mood. It fundamentally alters the biological rhythms, cognitive processes, and physical integrity of the human body, creating a state of existence where the will to live is eroded by a relentless internal attrition. To understand the grip of MDD on the American population, one must first descend into the neurobiological underpinnings that drive it. For decades, the public consciousness was fed the chemical imbalance theory, a simplified narrative suggesting a mere lack of serotonin was the culprit. While neurotransmitters are undeniably involved, modern neuroscience reveals a far more terrifyingly complex reality. Depression is a systemic failure of neuroplasticity and connectivity. It involves the atrophy of the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and emotional context, and the dysregulation of the amygdala, the center of fear and emotional processing. In a depressed brain, the communication pathways between the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and logic, and the limbic systems sever. The result is a biological inability to regulate negative emotion. The brain becomes trapped in a feedback loop of ruminative despair, physically incapable of imagining a future that is not a replica of current suffering. Furthermore, the role of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis cannot be overstated. In many sufferers of MDD, the body's stress response system is broken, locked in a chronic state of hyperarousal. This floods the system with cortisol, a stress hormone that in sustained high doses becomes neurotoxic. It literally corrodes neural connections. Thus, depression is not just a mental illness, it is a full-body inflammatory disease.
This inflammation manifests as the physical symptoms that are often overlooked in pop culture depictions of the disorder: the leaden paralysis of the limbs, the profound psychomotor retardation, where speech and movement become agonizingly slow, and the disruption of the circadian rhythm that results in insomnia or hypersomnia. The sufferer is not merely sad, they are physically exhausted at a cellular level, fighting a war against their own biology. The phenomenology of MDD, the subjective experience of the sufferer, is characterized primarily by anhedonia. This is the hallmark symptom that distinguishes clinical depression from ordinary grief. Anhedonia is the total eradication of the capacity for pleasure. Food loses its taste, music becomes noise, the embrace of a loved one feels like dead weight. It is a bleaching of the world, a reduction of the technicolor experience of life into a static gray buzz. This creates a terrifying sense of isolation. The depressed individual stands behind a pane of glass, watching the rest of humanity engage in a dance of emotions they can no longer access. This alienation is often compounded by the mask of sanity, a concept adapted to describe the immense effort sufferers exert to appear normal in professional and social settings. This performance requires a staggering amount of energy, known as high-functioning depression, where the collapse happens only behind closed doors, further delaying diagnosis and treatment. Historically, the American understanding of this condition has undergone radical shifts. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, what we now call MDD was often categorized under neurasthenia, or strictly melancholia, viewed through a lens of moral failing or constitutional weakness. The mid-20th century saw the rise of Freudian psychoanalysis, which posited that depression was anger turned inward, a result of unresolved conflicts and loss. However, the late 20th century brought the pharmacological revolution. The introduction of fluoxetine, Prozac, in 1987 marked a cultural watershed moment. Suddenly, depression was biochemical. It was treatable. It was destigmatized, yet simultaneously commodified. The Prozac Nation era shifted the narrative from the couch to the pharmacy counter. While this increased access to care, it also sparked a fierce debate regarding the over-medicalization of human suffering. Are we curing a disease, or are we medicating a natural response to a hyper-capitalist,
disconnected society? This brings us to the environmental catalysts fueling the current epidemic. The United States offers a perfect storm for the proliferation of MDD. The erosion of community structures, the decline of religious or secular communal gathering, and the atomization of the family unit have removed the traditional buffers against psychological distress. We are the most connected civilization in history, yet we report record levels of loneliness. The digital age has introduced a new vector for depression, the algorithmic curation of inadequacy. Social media platforms, designed to monopolize attention, create an environment of constant social comparison. For the developing brains of Generation Z and the millennials, this has proven devastating. The gap between one's lived reality and the curated perfection seen on a screen creates a dissonance that manifests as self-loathing and despair. Economically, the cost of MDD is staggering, estimated at over $210 billion annually in the United States alone. This figure encompasses direct medical costs, suicide-related costs, and workplace costs. The latter is dominated by presenteeism, when employees are physically at work but mentally absent, their cognitive functions slowed by the fog of depression. This invisible drain on productivity is a silent recession, a drag on the national GDP that goes largely unacknowledged in fiscal policy. The corporate world is slowly waking up to this, implementing wellness programs. Yet the structural stressors of the American workforce, long hours, stagnant wages, and the precariousness of the gig economy continue to serve as potent incubators for depressive episodes. Treatment for MDD remains one of the most contentious and evolving fields in medicine. The standard of care, a combination of psychotherapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, and pharmacotherapy, SSRIs or SNRIs, is effective for many but fails a significant percentage of patients. This subset, suffering from treatment-resistant depression, TRD, lives in a perpetual state of management rather than recovery. For these individuals, the darkness is unyielding. This desperation has driven the scientific community to revisit forbidden frontiers. We are currently witnessing a renaissance in psychedelic research. Compounds like psilocybin and ketamine are showing promise in rebooting the depressed brain, inducing states of neuroplasticity that allow patients to break free from rigid, negative thought patterns. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses magnetic fields to stimulate nerve cells, offers another non-invasive avenue. These advancements suggest we are on the cusp of a new paradigm, moving away from daily pill maintenance toward episodic transformative interventions. However, the shadow of mortality hangs heavy over MDD. It is the primary driver of suicide, a rate that has been climbing steadily in the US over the last 2 decades. The tragedy of suicide and MDD is that it is often a result of a cognitive distortion. The disease convinces the sufferer that they are a burden, that the world would be lighter without them. It is a lie told by a malfunctioning organ. The lethality of MDD makes it a medical emergency, yet the healthcare infrastructure is woefully inadequate. Wait times for psychiatrists can span months. Insurance coverage for mental health is often labyrinthine and limited. In the richest nation on earth, the care for the most common mental illness is frequently determined by one's bank account, leaving millions to navigate the abyss alone. Ultimately, major depressive disorder is a mirror reflecting the fractures in the American condition. It thrives in the silence between people, in the pressure to succeed, and in the biological vulnerability of the human animal. It is a thief of time, stealing years of vitality and potential. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the challenge is not just to develop better drugs, but to construct a society that is less conducive to the isolation and hopelessness that allows this disorder to flourish. 2. Generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, the engine of perpetual dread. If depression is the crushing weight of the past and the emptiness of the present, generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, is the terrifying colonization of the future. It is the second most common mental health challenge in the United States, yet it is frequently misunderstood as merely being stressed or high-strung. This minimization belies the brutal reality of the condition. GAD is a chronic, corrosive state of excessive, uncontrollable worry that persists for months or years. It is not a fear of a specific object or situation, like a phobia. Rather, it is a free-floating dread that attaches itself to every aspect of existence: health, finances, family, work, and the very stability of the world itself. It is the alarm bell that never stops ringing, a physiological state of siege where the fight-or-flight mechanism is jammed in the on position, slowly burning out the body and mind. To comprehend the mechanics of GAD, we must examine the primitive architecture of the human brain clashing with the complexities of modern American life. At the core of this disorder lies the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. In a neurotypical brain, the amygdala flags a danger, and the prefrontal cortex assesses the validity of that threat, dampening the response if the danger is not imminent. In the brain of a GAD sufferer, this regulatory circuit fails. The prefrontal cortex cannot inhibit the amygdala's screaming signals. Consequently, the brain perceives a missed email, a strange noise in the car engine, or a vague news headline as a life or death threat equivalent to a predator in the brush. This results in a constant flood of adrenaline and cortisol, keeping the sufferer in a state of hypervigilance. They are scanning the horizon for a disaster that has not happened and likely never will, but the possibility of it is enough to induce paralysis. The cognitive landscape of GAD is dominated by the what-if loop. This is a form of catastrophic thinking where the mind swiftly escalates a minor concern into a worst-case scenario. A child coming home late from school is not just tardy. In the mind of the GAD sufferer, they have been abducted or injured. A slight pain in the chest is not indigestion, it is the onset of a fatal heart attack. This intolerance of uncertainty is the fuel that powers the disorder.
The GAD mind demands absolute guarantees of safety and predictability, commodities that life simply cannot provide. To mitigate this terror, sufferers engage in safety behaviors, excessive checking, reassurance seeking, and over-preparation. Yet these behaviors only reinforce the anxiety, confirming to the brain that the danger was real and that only the vigilance prevented the catastrophe. Physically, generalized anxiety disorder is punishing. The popular image of anxiety is mental, racing thoughts and worry, but the somatic symptoms are often what drive patients to primary care physicians. GAD manifests as chronic muscle tension, particularly in the shoulders, neck, and jaw, leading to tension headaches and TMJ disorders. It wreaks havoc on the gastrointestinal system, as the gut-brain axis is intimately linked to stress levels. Irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, is highly comorbid with GAD. Sufferers report a sensation of air hunger or shallow breathing, trembling, fatigue, and profound sleep disturbances. The inability to shut off the worrying mind at night leads to chronic insomnia, which in turn lowers the threshold for anxiety the next day, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of exhaustion and fear. The cultural ecosystem of the United States acts as a potent accelerant for GAD. We live in the age of anxiety, a term coined by W.H. Auden but perfected by the 21st century information economy. The American ethos of rugged individualism, combined with a hyper-competitive capitalist structure, places the burden of success and survival squarely on the shoulders of the individual. Failure is not seen as bad luck but as a personal defect. This pressure cooker creates a fertile ground for worry. Furthermore, the 24-hour news cycle and the pervasive nature of social media have commodified crisis. We are subjected to a non-stop barrage of global trauma, pandemics, wars, economic collapse, climate change, delivered instantly to our pockets. The human brain was evolved to handle local threats, not to process the collective suffering of the entire planet in real time. For the GAD sufferer, this doom-scrolling validates their internal narrative that the world is an inherently dangerous, hostile place. Historically, anxiety has always been part of the human condition, a necessary survival tool. However, the classification of GAD as a distinct clinical entity is relatively modern. In the early days of psychiatry,
it was often lumped in with anxiety neurosis or seen as a symptom of other conditions. It wasn't until the DSM-3 in 1980 that GAD began to take shape as a specific diagnosis, and even then, the criteria have been refined to distinguish it from normal stress. The explosion of diagnoses in recent decades parallels the rise of the safety culture in America. As we have made the physical world safer, reducing accidents, curing diseases, regulating food, our tolerance for risk has plummeted. We have become allergic to uncertainty. Paradoxically, the safer we become, the more anxious we feel about the remaining risks, however microscopic they may be. The interplay between GAD and substance use disorder is a critical, often tragic component of the narrative. Many sufferers discover that alcohol or benzodiazepines like Xanax or Valium provide an immediate chemical silence to the cacophony in their heads. These substances mimic the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA, forcibly slowing down the nervous system. This creates a trap of self-medication. The relief is temporary, and the rebound anxiety, the surge of panic that occurs when the substance wears off, is often worse than the baseline anxiety. This dynamic has contributed significantly to the benzodiazepine dependence crisis in the US, a quieter but no less deadly cousin to the opioid epidemic. The medical community is now grappling with the challenge of treating anxiety without creating addiction, moving away from sedatives towards safer, long-term solutions. Treatment for GAD requires a fundamental rewiring of how the patient relates to their own thoughts. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is the gold standard, challenging the validity of the what-if scenarios and teaching patients to tolerate uncertainty. Exposure therapy, while more common for phobias, is also used to help GAD sufferers confront their fears of failure or imperfection without engaging in safety behaviors. Mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, have also gained traction, teaching patients to observe their anxious thoughts without judging them or reacting to them, to exist in the eye of the storm rather than trying to stop the wind. Pharmacologically, SSRIs and SNRIs are the first-line treatments, helping to balance the serotonin and norepinephrine levels that regulate mood and anxiety, though they lack the instant shut-off effect of sedatives, requiring patience and compliance.
The economic impact of GAD is insidious. While depression causes absenteeism, anxiety often causes significant impairment while working. The anxious employee is often perfectionistic, afraid to delegate, paralyzed by decision-making, and exhausted. They burn out faster. The healthcare costs are also inflated by the medical mimicry of anxiety. GAD sufferers frequently utilize emergency rooms for chest pains and palpitations that are panic-induced, leading to billions of dollars in unnecessary cardiac workups and diagnosed fasts. Perhaps the most profound aspect of generalized anxiety disorder is its existential dimension. It is a disorder of control. At its heart, GAD is a desperate, flailing attempt to control the uncontrollable variables of life. In a nation that idolizes control over our bodies, our careers, our destinies, GAD is the glitch in the matrix. It exposes the terrifying truth that we are vulnerable, that safety is an illusion, and that chaos is the natural state of the universe. The recovery from GAD, therefore, is not just a medical process, but a philosophical one, the learning of surrender. It is the acceptance that we cannot foresee every outcome, that we cannot protect everyone we love from everything, and that we must live fully in the present moment, despite the looming shadow of the unknown. As we look to the future, the prevalence of GAD shows no signs of plateauing. The increasing precariousness of the global geopolitical landscape, the rapid pace of technological change, including the anxiety surrounding artificial intelligence and job displacement, and the lingering psychological scars of the COVID-19 pandemic suggest that anxiety will remain a dominant feature of the American psyche. The challenge for the mental health field is to scale accessible, evidence-based treatments and to foster a cultural shift that values resilience and community over perfection and isolation. Until then, millions of Americans will continue to wake up every morning, bracing themselves for a disaster that exists only in the terrifying, infinite potential of their own minds.
3. Panic disorder, the internal cataclysm. If generalized anxiety disorder is the slow erosion of the spirit by a relentless tide of worry, panic disorder is the sudden, violent tsunami that destroys the landscape in a matter of minutes. It is, without hyperbole, one of the most terrifying visceral experiences a human being can endure while physically unharmed. To the observer, a person in the throes of a panic attack may look merely distressed or frozen. Internally, however, they are living through a physiological simulation of their own death. Panic disorder is characterized not just by the attacks themselves, intense surges of fear reaching a peak within minutes, but by the debilitating obsessive fear of the next attack. It is a disorder of anticipation, a condition where the brain's alarm system malfunctions so catastrophically that safety becomes a foreign concept, and the body becomes a prison of unpredictable terror. To understand the mechanics of panic disorder, we must look beyond the psychological and into the primal circuitry of survival. The epicenter of this neural earthquake is the fear network, primarily involving the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus, a small nucleus in the pons of the brainstem, plays a critical role in the synthesis of norepinephrine, noradrenaline, the neurotransmitter responsible for the body's mobilization for action. In individuals with panic disorder, this region is hypersensitive. It acts like a faulty smoke detector that interprets a burnt piece of toast as a raging inferno. When triggered, often by benign physiological shifts like a slight increase in heart rate, a change in breathing, or a drop in blood sugar, the locus coeruleus floods the system with adrenaline. This is not a gradual ramp-up, it is an immediate chemical dump that shocks the cardiovascular and respiratory systems into overdrive. The defining characteristic of panic disorder, distinguishing it from other anxiety conditions, is the catastrophic misinterpretation of bodily sensations. This is the cognitive spark that ignites the biological fuel. A sufferer might feel a skipped heartbeat, a benign palpitation, and immediately interpret it as the onset of cardiac arrest. They might feel a moment of lightheadedness and interpret it as an impending stroke or a fainting spell that will leave them vulnerable and humiliated. This misinterpretation triggers the fear response, which releases more adrenaline,
which intensifies the symptoms, which confirms the catastrophic belief. It is a positive feedback loop of terror that spirals out of control in seconds. The physical symptoms are profound and mimic acute medical emergencies: chest pain, tachycardia, rapid heart rate, diaphoresis, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, nausea, and paresthesia, numbness or tingling. A specific and fascinating biological theory gaining traction in the understanding of panic disorder is the suffocation false alarm theory proposed by Dr. Donald Klein. This hypothesis suggests that the brains of panic sufferers possess a hypersensitive carbon dioxide monitor. In a neurotypical brain, a slight rise in blood CO2 levels, caused by shallow breathing or holding one's breath, triggers a subtle urge to breathe. In a panic sufferer, this same rise is interpreted by the brainstem as suffocation and immediate threat to life. The brain triggers a gasps for air response, leading to hyperventilation. Paradoxically, hyperventilation causes a drop in CO2 levels, which constricts blood vessels in the brain, leading to the dizziness and derealization that further terrifies the patient. This explains why many panic attacks seem to strike out of the blue, often during relaxation or sleep, nocturnal panic attacks, when breathing patterns naturally shift. The phenomenology of a panic attack involves more than just physical pain. It involves a profound disillusion of reality. Many sufferers report symptoms of depersonalization, feeling detached from one's body, as if observing oneself from a distance, and derealization, the feeling that the external world is unreal, foggy, or distorted. This unreality is a defense mechanism of the brain, attempting to distance the consciousness from overwhelming trauma, but in the context of a panic attack, it feels like the onset of insanity. The fear of going crazy or losing control is a hallmark criterion of the diagnosis. The sufferer is trapped in a paradox. They feel they are losing their mind, yet they are hyper-aware of every agonizing second of the experience. The historical trajectory of panic disorder is a journey from the cardiac ward to the psychiatrist's couch. During the American Civil War, the condition was observed in soldiers and labeled DaCosta syndrome, or soldier's heart, believed to be a functional disorder of the cardiovascular system caused by overexertion. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries,
Freud categorized it under anxiety neurosis, viewing it through a psychosexual lens. It wasn't until the landmark introduction of the DSM-3 in 1980 that panic disorder was carved out as a distinct diagnostic entity, separating it from generalized anxiety. This separation was crucial because it recognized that panic attacks are qualitatively different from high anxiety. They are discrete, explosive events that require specific therapeutic interventions. The societal and economic footprint of panic disorder is massive, largely due to the phenomenon of mechalmimicry. Because the symptoms so closely resemble heart attacks, pulmonary embolisms, and respiratory failure, sufferers are frequent utilizers of emergency medical services. It is estimated that a significant percentage of patients presenting to ERs with chest pain have no cardiac pathology, but are suffering from undiagnosed panic disorder. This leads to billions of dollars in unnecessary angiograms, MRIs, and hospital admissions. The tragedy lies in the interaction that often follows. The patient is told there is nothing wrong with you, or it's just stress, a dismissal that invalidates the excruciating physical reality of their experience. They are discharged with a mental health referral, only to return weeks later when the next attack hits, convinced that this time the doctors missed something fatal. This cycle often births the most debilitating complication of panic disorder, agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is not, as commonly believed, simply a fear of open spaces. It is a fear of situations from which escape might be difficult, or where help might not be available in the event of a panic attack. To avoid the terror of an attack in public, the sufferer begins to restrict their geography. First, they stop driving on highways. Then, they avoid crowded supermarkets. Eventually, the safe zone shrinks to the confines of their own home, or even a single room. The world becomes a minefield. This constriction of life leads to profound social isolation, job loss, and depression, compounding the tragedy of the disorder. The person is not just fighting fear, they are fighting a shrinking existence. Treatment for panic disorder is a testament to the success of modern psychological science, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The most effective component of CBT for this condition is interoceptive exposure.
This technique involves courageously inducing the physical sensations of panic in a controlled environment to desensitize the brain. A patient might be asked to spin in a chair to induce dizziness, breathe through a straw to simulate air hunger, or run in place to elevate heart rate. By repeatedly experiencing these sensations without the accompanying catastrophe, i.e. getting dizzy but not fainting, racing heart but no heart attack, the brain undergoes extinction learning. The link between the sensation and the terror is severed. The patient learns that the symptoms are uncomfortable but not dangerous. Pharmacologically, the landscape is complex. SSRIs are the first-line maintenance treatment, helping to raise the threshold for panic over time. However, the immediate relief provided by benzodiazepines, Xanax, Klonopin, and Ativan, presents a seductive trap. These drugs work instantly to quell an attack, acting as a chemical brake on the central nervous system. However, they can prevent the patient from learning to tolerate the symptoms naturally, creating a psychological dependence on the pill as a safety signal. Long-term use can lead to physical tolerance, horrific withdrawal syndromes that mimic panic itself, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. Modern psychiatry is increasingly cautious with these medications, viewing them as a temporary bridge rather than a solution. In the digital age, panic disorder faces new vectors of transmission. The modern environment is one of sensory overload, a cacophony of notifications, artificial lights, and urban density that keeps the nervous system in a state of low-grade arousal, lowering the threshold for panic. Furthermore, the consumption of high-caffeine energy drinks and stimulants, ubiquitous in American American work culture acts as a direct chemical trigger for panic attacks in susceptible individuals. We have built a society that demands high energy output while simultaneously eroding the restorative downtime required to regulate our biology. Looking forward, technology offers both risk and salvation. While digital overstimulation is a culprit, wearable technology and biofeedback devices are emerging as powerful tools for management. Smartwatches that detect heart rate variability, HRV, can alert a user to rising stress levels before a full-blown attack occurs.
Prompting breathing exercises that stimulate the vagus nerve and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode. The future of treatment lies in this real-time intervention, moving from reactive crisis management to predictive regulation. Until then, panic disorder remains a silent, terrifying epidemic, a condition where the body turns against the self and the simple act of existing becomes an act of bravery.
4. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the haunting of the present. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is the shattering of time. It is a disorder where the past refuses to stay in the past, instead invading the present with the visceral intensity of a living nightmare. While other mental health disorders may distort reality or mood, PTSD creates a parallel reality, a superimposition of a traumatic memory onto the current moment. It is a biological injury to the memory processing systems of the brain, resulting in a state of existence where safety is impossible because the threat is encoded into the very DNA of the sufferer's perception. In the United States, a nation forged in revolution and sustained by perpetual conflict, yet also plagued by high rates of interpersonal violence, PTSD is a spectral force that affects approximately 3.6% of the adult population annually. However, the statistics fail to capture the qualitative horror of the condition, the fragmentation of the self, and the destruction of the narrative of one's life. To comprehend PTSD, one must dismantle the myth that it is exclusively a soldier's disease. While combat veterans are the most visible demographic, the vast majority of PTSD cases in America are civilians, survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, severe accidents, natural disasters, and childhood abuse. The democratization of trauma means that the battlefield is everywhere: the bedroom, the highway, the school. The disorder represents a failure of the brain's natural recovery process. Most human beings, when exposed to trauma, will experience a period of acute stress followed by a gradual return to baseline. In PTSD, this recovery is arrested. The brain gets stuck in the trauma time. The neurobiology of PTSD is a study in structural alteration. Neuroimaging studies have consistently shown that the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for consolidating memories and placing them in the correct context of time and space, is physically smaller in chronic PTSD sufferers. Under normal circumstances, the hippocampus acts as a librarian, filing a memory away as something that happened in the past. In PTSD, the stress hormones flooding the brain during the trauma, cortisol and adrenaline, act as a toxin to the hippocampus, inhibiting its function. Consequently, the memory is not filed away. It remains raw and sensory-based. When triggered, the memory does not play back like a movie. It is re-experienced.
This is the flashback. The sufferer does not just remember the rape or the explosion. They smell the smoke. They feel the weight of the attacker. Their heart rate spikes to 160 beats per minute. The amygdala, the alarm system, screams that the danger is happening now, and the prefrontal cortex, the logic center, goes offline, unable to override the terror with the knowledge that I am safe in my living room. The symptomatology of PTSD is categorized into 4 clusters, creating a complex web of dysfunction. First are the intrusion symptoms: flashbacks, nightmares, and distressing memories. Second is avoidance, the desperate effort to avoid anything that reminds the sufferer of the trauma. This can manifest as avoiding crowds, driving, specific people, or even emotions. Third are negative alterations in cognition and mood, a pervasive sense of blame, detachment from others, and an inability to experience positive emotions, emotional numbing. Finally, there is hyperarousal and reactivity. The sufferer is perpetually jumpy, irritable, prone to angry outbursts, and hypervigilant. They sit with their backs to the wall in restaurants. They scan rooftops. They flinch at sudden movements. This constant state of red alert exhausts the body's metabolic resources, leading to high rates of comorbid autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular issues, and chronic pain. The historical evolution of PTSD is a narrative of struggle for validation. For centuries, the symptoms were dismissed as moral failings. In the Civil War, it was nostalgia. In World War I, it was shell shock, initially attributed to the concussive force of exploding shells, until it was found in soldiers far from the front lines. World War II brought combat fatigue, and the Vietnam War birthed post-Vietnam syndrome. It was the tireless advocacy of Vietnam veterans, combined with the feminist movement working with rape survivors, that forced the psychiatric community to recognize trauma as a legitimate cause of mental illness. In 1980, PTSD was finally entered into the DSM-3. This was a watershed moment. It shifted the blame from the individual's character, he is a coward, to the external event. He was exposed to something no human should endure.
A critical and evolving distinction in the field is the concept of complex PTSD, CPTSD. While traditional PTSD is often linked to a single acute event, a car crash, a terrorist attack, CPTSD arises from prolonged and repetitive trauma from which there is no escape, such as long-term childhood abuse, domestic violence, or human trafficking. CPTSD includes all the symptoms of standard PTSD, but adds a layer of disturbances of self-organization. This involves profound emotional dysregulation, a negative self-concept, toxic shame, and persistent difficulties in relationships. While the DSM-5 does not yet list CPTSD as a separate diagnosis, unlike the ICD-11 used internationally, American clinicians are increasingly recognizing it, understanding that the treatment for a singular trauma differs vastly from the treatment of a personality formed within the crucible of abuse. The cultural impact of PTSD in the United States is profound. It is a major driver of the suicide epidemic, particularly among veterans, where the statistic 22 a day has become a rallying cry for reform. But beyond the military, PTSD erodes the social fabric through the mechanism of secondary trauma. Spouses and children of PTSD sufferers often develop their own anxiety and behavioral issues, living in a household governed by the unpredictable storms of the sufferer's symptoms. This intergenerational transmission of trauma is not just psychological, but biological. The field of epigenetics has revealed that trauma can leave a chemical mark on the genes, altering how they are expressed. Studies on the children of Holocaust survivors and 9/11 survivors suggest that the sensitivity to stress can be passed down, meaning the legacy of trauma can ripple through bloodlines long after the original event has ceased. The treatment landscape for PTSD is currently undergoing a revolutionary shift. Traditional talk therapy can sometimes be re-traumatizing, as talking about the event activates the fear center without resolving it. Evidence-based therapies like prolonged exposure, PE, and cognitive processing therapy, CPT, have been the standard, working to desensitize the patient. However, the emergence of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, changed the game. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation, moving eyes back and forth while recalling the trauma. This mechanism is believed to mimic REM sleep, helping the brain unfreeze the memory and process it from the amygdala to the hippocampus. Patients often report that the memory loses its emotional charge, becoming a narrative of the past rather than a terror of the present. Even more radical is the renaissance of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, has conducted Phase 3 clinical trials using MDMA, ecstasy, to treat severe PTSD, with results that the FDA has designated as a breakthrough therapy. MDMA works by dampening the activity of the amygdala while increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex and releasing oxytocin, the bonding hormone. This allows the patient to revisit the traumatic memory with a sense of compassion and safety without being overwhelmed by fear. They can look the monster in the eye and dismantle it. This represents a potential paradigm shift from chronic symptom management to actual curative healing. Another physiological frontier is the stellate ganglion block, SGB. This procedure involves injecting a local anesthetic into a bundle of nerves in the neck that helps regulate the fight or flight response. For many veterans and survivors, SGB acts as a biological reset button, turning off the constant adrenaline drip and allowing the nervous system to calm down for months at a time, creating a window of opportunity for therapy to take hold. The concept of post-traumatic growth offers a glimmer of light in the darkness. This theory posits that the struggle with the aftermath of trauma can lead to positive psychological changes, a greater appreciation for life, deeper relationships, increased personal strength, and spiritual development. It does not negate the pain, but suggests that the shattering of the self can provide the raw materials to build a more resilient, empathetic, and profound identity. As the United States grapples with the collective traumas of the 21st century, mass shootings, political polarization, and the lingering effects of the pandemic, PTSD remains a critical public health challenge. It forces us to confront the limits of human endurance and the necessity of community support. The path forward requires a destigmatization of the injured mind, recognizing that PTSD is not a weakness, but a biological witness to the horrors that human beings inflict and endure. It is a testament to the fact that the body keeps the score, and that healing requires not just the silencing of symptoms, but the restoration of the capacity to feel safe in one's own skin.
5. Bipolar disorder, the fire and the flood. To inhabit the world of bipolar disorder is to live on a biological pendulum that swings violently between the exhilarating, dangerous heights of godhood and the crushing subterranean depths of despair. Formerly known as manic depressive illness, this condition represents one of the most dramatic and devastating malfunctions of the human mood regulation system. It is not merely a fluctuation of emotions, it is a seismic shift in energy, perception, and reality testing. Affecting approximately 2.8% of the U.S. adult population annually, bipolar disorder is a condition of extremes that ravages the circadian rhythms and cognitive architecture of those it afflicts. It is a disorder that demands a heavy price for its moments of brilliance, often romanticized in culture, but lived as a chaotic tragedy by patients and their families. The defining characteristic of bipolar disorder is the presence of mania, or its milder cousin, hypomania. To understand the seductive and destructive power of mania, one must discard the notion of happiness. Mania is not happiness, it is electricity. It is a state of hyperarousal where the brain's inhibitory mechanisms collapse. In a full-blown manic episode, the hallmark of bipolar 1, the sufferer requires little to no sleep, yet feels bursting with limitless energy. Thoughts race at the speed of light, a phenomenon known as flight of ideas, where connections between unrelated concepts seem divinely inspired. The ego inflates to grotesque proportions. A barista might believe they have solved the unified field theory of physics, or an accountant might decide to liquidate their savings to start a global empire on a whim. This grandiosity is often accompanied by pressured speech, a rapid-fire, uninterruptible torrent of words that listeners leave exhausted. However, the fire of mania burns indiscriminately. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for risk assessment and impulse control, goes offline. This leads to catastrophic behavior, reckless driving, sexual promiscuity with strangers, massive spending sprees that bankrupt families, and substance abuse. The manic brain is a dopamine furnace, consuming the neurotransmitter at a rate that overrides all survival instincts. For the sufferer, it feels like an awakening. They often describe the rest of the world as slow or gray. They feel chosen, invincible, and euphoric. But as the mania escalates,
It often bleeds into dysphoria, an agitated paranoid state, or psychosis, where hallucinations and delusions fracture reality completely. The high is a biological loan, and the interest rate is extortionate. When the crash comes, it is absolute. The depressive phase of bipolar disorder is often described as clinically distinct from, and frequently more severe than, unipolar depression. It is a physical inertia, a leaden paralysis, where the very act of breathing feels like labor. Because the brain has exhausted its neurochemical reserves during the manic phase, the drop is precipitous. The suicide rate among individuals with bipolar disorder is staggering, estimated to be 15 to 20 times higher than the general population. The tragedy lies in the contrast. The sufferer remembers the feeling of flying, which makes the cage of depression feel even more suffocating. This is the cruel cycle. The memory of the fire makes the ice unbearable. The diagnostic landscape distinguishes between bipolar 1, defined by full manic episodes that often require hospitalization, and bipolar 2, characterized by hypomania, a less severe functional high, and severe depressive episodes. Bipolar 2 is frequently misdiagnosed as major depression because patients rarely complain about hypomania. They view it as their productive or true self. They only seek help when they crash. This misdiagnosis is dangerous because treating bipolar disorder with standard antidepressants, SSRIs, without a mood stabilizer can inadvertently trigger a manic switch, sending the patient spiraling into instability. There is also cyclothymia, a chronic fluctuating mood disturbance that, while milder, keeps the sufferer in a perpetual state of emotional motion sickness. The neurobiology of bipolar disorder is a subject of intense research, pointing toward a fundamental dysregulation of the cellular clock. The condition is deeply tied to the circadian rhythm, the body's internal 24-hour clock. Sufferers have a genetic vulnerability where their biological rhythms are easily desynchronized by environmental triggers, particularly sleep deprivation. A missed night of sleep can be the catalyst that flips the switch into mania. At a cellular level, research suggests mitochondrial dysfunction and abnormalities in calcium signaling within neurons. The brain of a bipolar patient struggles to maintain homeostasis. It lacks the shock absorbers to handle stress or stimulation,
causing the neural firing rates to oscillate wildly. Genetic studies indicate it is highly heritable, sharing a significant genetic overlap with schizophrenia, suggesting these two disorders exist on a spectrum of psychosis and mood dysregulation. Historically, bipolar disorder has been the companion of genius and madness. The ancient Greeks recognized it, but it was the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin in the late 19th century who distinguished manic depressive insanity from dementia praecox, schizophrenia, noting its episodic nature. The 20th century brought the lithium revolution. In 1949, Australian psychiatrist John Cade discovered the mood-stabilizing properties of lithium carbonate, a simple salt, in guinea pigs. When applied to humans, it was a miracle. It remains the gold standard for treatment, specifically for quelling mania and reducing suicide risk. Lithium is unique. It is one of the few psychotropic drugs that is an element on the periodic table, not a synthesized compound. Its discovery emptied the asylums of the mid-century, allowing millions to return to society. However, the treatment of bipolar disorder is fraught with a unique challenge: non-compliance. Unlike other disorders where patients are desperate for relief, bipolar patients often miss their symptoms. They miss the mania. They miss the energy, the confidence, and the productivity. Lithium and other mood stabilizers like valproate or lamotrigine can make patients feel flat or gray in comparison to the technicolor experience of mania. The seduction of the high leads many to discontinue medication, convinced they are cured or that they can control the ride. This leads to the revolving door phenomenon of repeated hospitalizations. The management of the disorder requires a lifelong commitment to a regimen that includes strict sleep hygiene, medication adherence, and psychotherapy to recognize the early warning signs of a mood shift. The cultural narrative of bipolar disorder is heavily influenced by the tortured artist trope. History is littered with figures believed to have suffered from the condition: Vincent van Gogh, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, and modern icons like Kanye West. This association has created a dangerous romanticization of the illness, suggesting that the madness is necessary for the creativity. While studies verify a higher prevalence of bipolar disorder in creative populations,
the reality is that the disorder destroys more creativity than it creates. The depressive phases are periods of total silence and non-production, and the manic phases, while generative, often result in incoherent or unfinished work. The art that survives is usually produced during periods of euthymia, stability, or the mild hypomanic states, not the psychotic breaks. The economic and social costs are immense. Bipolar disorder often strikes in late adolescence or early adulthood, disrupting education and career trajectories. The impulsivity of mania can lead to legal troubles, destroyed marriages, and financial ruin. The stigma is particularly sharp. While depression evokes sympathy, the erratic behavior of mania often evokes fear or judgment. Patients are frequently labeled as unreliable or drama queens before they are recognized as sick. The workplace is rarely accommodating to a condition that requires strict routine and low stress, leading to high rates of unemployment and disability. Looking to the future, the field of precision psychiatry offers hope. Researchers are identifying biomarkers that could predict which patients will respond to lithium versus other stabilizers, saving years of trial and error. There is also a growing emphasis on interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, IPSRT, which focuses on stabilizing daily routines to anchor the biological clock. As we learn more about the gut-brain axis and the role of inflammation, new anti-inflammatory treatments are being explored. Ultimately, the goal is to tame the sine wave, to narrow the amplitude of the swings so that the person can live within the middle range of human emotion without sacrificing the spark that makes them who they are.
6. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, the fractured focus. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is perhaps the most misnamed and misunderstood condition in the psychiatric lexicon. The name implies a deficit, a lack of attention. In reality, the ADHD brain is not suffering from a shortage of attention, it is suffering from an inability to regulate it. It is an abundance of attention, pulled in 1,000 directions simultaneously, with a broken steering wheel. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder of the executive functions, the management system of the brain responsible for planning, organizing, initiating tasks, and regulating emotions. Affecting roughly 4 to 5% of adults and nearly 10% of children in the US, ADHD is not a behavioral problem caused by bad parenting or too much sugar. It is a distinct physiological difference in how the brain processes dopamine and perceives time. To visualize the ADHD experience, imagine a Ferrari engine equipped with bicycle brakes. The mind races constantly, generating ideas, observations, and internal monologues at a breakneck pace, but the mechanism to slow down, prioritize, or stop is faulty. This is due to the neuroanatomy of the condition. Structural imaging shows that ADHD brains often have a slightly smaller prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia, and crucially, a deficiency in the neurotransmitters dopamine and norepinephrine. These chemicals are the fuel for the brain's reward and focus systems. In a neurotypical brain, completing a boring task like filing taxes releases a small drip of dopamine, providing the motivation to keep going. In an ADHD brain, that drip is absent. The brain is chemically starved of stimulation. This dopamine deficit creates a nervous system that is interest-based rather than importance-based. A neurotypical person can use the concept of importance, I must do this to keep my job, to motivate action. An ADHD person often cannot. If a task is not interesting, novel, challenging, or urgent, their brain physically refuses to engage. It is like trying to start a car with no spark plugs. Conversely, when the ADHD brain is interested, it enters a state of hyperfocus, a trance-like absorption where time vanishes, and the person can work for 12 hours straight, forgetting to eat or sleep.
This paradox, the inability to focus on a 10-minute chore but the ability to focus on a 10-hour project, is what confuses observers and leads to the accusation that the sufferer is lazy or just not trying. The symptoms of ADHD extend far beyond the classroom. One of the most debilitating aspects is time blindness. For the ADHD mind, there are only two times, now and not now. The future is an abstract concept that holds no emotional weight until it becomes the immediate present. This leads to chronic procrastination, not out of laziness, but because the brain cannot feel the urgency of a deadline until it is imminent. This creates a life lived on the edge of panic, relying on the adrenaline of the last minute to compensate for the lack of dopamine. Another largely discussed but clinically critical component is emotional dysregulation. The filter that separates an emotion from a reaction is porous in ADHD. Frustration flashes instantly into rage, sadness spirals into despair. A specific manifestation of this is rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD, a condition where perceived criticism or rejection causes extreme, almost physical emotional pain. This makes relationships and professional feedback minefields, often causing the sufferer to become a people pleaser or to withdraw socially to avoid the agony of disapproval. The history of ADHD reflects a slow awakening to the complexity of the mind. In 1902, British pediatrician Sir George Still described children with an abnormal defect of moral control, marking the first clinical recognition. For decades, it was known as hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, focusing entirely on the physical restlessness of young boys. It wasn't until the 1980s that the focus shifted to attention deficit, and only recently has the medical community fully grasped the prevalence of adult ADHD and the presentation in women. Women with ADHD often present primarily with inattention, daydreaming, disorganization, rather than hyperactivity, leading to decades of them being dismissed as spacey or anxious. This gender gap has resulted in a lost generation of women who are only now in their 30s and 40s receiving diagnoses after a lifetime of unexplained struggle. The treatment of ADHD is dominated by the stimulant controversy. Medications like methylphenidate, Ritalin, and amphetamines, Aderine, are the most effective psychotropic drugs in psychiatry, working for about 80% of patients.
They function by increasing the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapse, essentially tightening the brakes of the brain. The paradox is that giving a stimulant to a hyperactive person calms them down. For the ADHD brain, the medication reduces the internal noise, allowing for linear thought. However, the potential for abuse and the diversion of these drugs on college campuses has created a stigma that makes access difficult for legitimate patients. The current shortage of ADHD medications in the U.S. highlights the fragility of this supply chain and the dependence of millions on these substances to function in a capitalist society. Culturally, ADHD is currently having a massive moment of visibility, largely driven by social media platforms like TikTok. The hashtag ADHD hashtag has billions of views, where creators share their symptoms and hacks. While this has undoubtedly raised awareness and destigmatized the condition, it has also led to the TikTokification of mental health, where normal human experiences, losing keys, getting distracted, are pathologized as clinical disorders. This self-diagnosis trend complicates the work of clinicians, who must distinguish between a dopamine-fried attention span caused by digital addiction and true neurodevelopmental ADHD. The ADHD tax is a term used to describe the financial penalty of the disorder: late fees, parking tickets, impulse purchases, and the cost of replacing lost items. But the cost is also professional. The modern open plan office, with its constant interruptions and demand for administrative drudgery, is a hostile environment for the ADHD brain. However, in the right environment, ADHD can be a superpower. The divergent thinking, the ability to hyperfocus, the willingness to take risks, and the high energy levels make ADHD individuals excellent entrepreneurs, emergency responders, and artists. They thrive in chaos and novelty. The hunter versus farmer hypothesis suggests that ADHD is not a disorder, but an evolutionary adaptation. In a hunter-gatherer society, the traits of ADHD, hypervigilance, rapid shifting of attention, impulsivity, were advantageous for spotting predators and hunting prey. It is only in the farmer society, agricultural, industrial, and now corporate, which requires long-term planning, patience, and repetitive tasks, that these traits become a disability. We have taken hunters and forced them to sit in cubicles. As we look forward,
the conversation around ADHD is shifting toward neurodiversity, the idea that different brain types are natural and valuable. The challenge for the American education and employment systems is to move away from a one-size-fits-all model. Accommodations like flexible hours, body doubling, working alongside someone, and breaking tasks into gamified chunks are proving that with the right scaffolding, the ADHD brain can outperform the neurotypical one. Yet without diagnosis and treatment, the outcomes remain grim. Untreated ADHD is linked to significantly higher rates of incarceration, divorce, substance abuse, and car accidents. It is a disorder of potential, the tragic gap between what a person is capable of and what they can actually execute. Bridging that gap is the central struggle of the ADHD life.
7. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, the tyranny of the doubting mind. To speak of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, in the vernacular of the 21st century is to engage with a profound linguistic error. The term has been hijacked by pop culture, reduced to a quirky adjective describing a preference for color-coded bookshelves or a tidy desktop. This trivialization serves to mask one of the most debilitating, torturous, and isolating conditions known to psychiatry. OCD is not a personality quirk, it is a neurological cage match where the sufferer is locked in perpetual combat with their own brain. It is the doubting disease, a disorder that attacks the very core of a person's values, identity, and sense of reality. The World Health Organization has ranked it among the top 10 most handicapping illnesses by lost income and quality of life, placing it in the same category of debilitation as schizophrenia or quadriplegia. The architecture of OCD is built upon a cruel and repetitive cycle: the obsession, the anxiety, the compulsion, and the relief. It begins with the obsession, an unwanted, intrusive thought, image, or urge that strikes with the violence of a psychic assault. These are not worries about real-life problems like bills or health. They are ego-dystonic, meaning they are diametrically opposed to the sufferer's true personality and desires. A loving mother might be bombarded with graphic images of stabbing her newborn. A devout priest might be plagued by blasphemous sexual thoughts during prayer. A person who values safety might be paralyzed by the conviction that they hit a pedestrian miles back on the highway. These thoughts are not fantasies, they are horrors. The brain sends a glitch signal, tagging these benign or random thoughts as immediate catastrophic threats. This triggers the second phase, profound visceral anxiety. This is not mere nervousness, it is a primal terror, a fight or flight response to a danger that exists entirely within the mind. To neutralize this terror, the sufferer engages in the compulsion. This is the ritual, the washing of hands until they bleed, the checking of the stove 30 times, the silent recitation of prayers, or the mental retracing of steps. The compulsion provides a hit of temporary relief, lowering the anxiety. However, this relief is the trap. By performing the ritual, the brain learns a false lesson. The only reason the catastrophe didn't happen is because I did the ritual.
The neural pathway is reinforced. The next time the thought occurs, the urge to perform the compulsion is stronger. The cycle tightens. The sufferer becomes a slave to a logic they know is irrational but cannot resist. The neurobiology of OCD offers a fascinating glimpse into the mechanics of the human will. Current research points to a malfunction in the corticostriato-thalamocortical, or CSTC, loop. This is the brain's information processing circuit. In a neurotypical brain, the orbital frontal cortex detects a mistake or a concern. Are my hands sturdy? Sends a signal to the striatum, the gear shift, which filters the information. If the concern is minor, the caudate nucleus acts as a brake, dismissing the thought, and the thalamus allows the person to move on. In the OCD brain, the brake is broken. The caudate nucleus fails to filter the error signal. Consequently, the thalamus becomes hyperactive, looping the warning signal back to the frontal cortex over and over again. The brain is literally stuck in gear, grinding against itself, screaming danger when there is none. The manifestations of OCD are far more diverse and terrifying than the stereotype of the hand washer. While contamination OCD is common, the pure O, or purely obsessional variant, represents a silent hell. In these cases, the compulsions are not physical actions but mental rituals, counting, reviewing memories, or neutralizing bad words with good words. Subtypes include harm OCD, where the sufferer lives in fear of losing control and becoming a violent psychopath. Sexual orientation OCD, where one obsesses endlessly over their sexuality despite years of established history. And scrupulosity, a moral or religious obsession where every action is weighed against an impossible standard of purity. There is also relationship OCD, where the sufferer is tormented by doubts about whether they truly love their partner or if their partner is the one, dissecting every interaction for proof of compatibility. The history of OCD is a journey from the spiritual to the synaptic. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the symptoms of OCD, particularly the blasphemous intrusive thoughts, were viewed through the lens of demonology. Sufferers were believed to be possessed or tormented by the devil, leading to exorcisms rather than treatment. In the 17th century, it was known as religious melancholy. It was not until the 19th century that it moved into the realm of psychology.
And later, Sigmund Freud famously analyzed the rat man, interpreting his obsessions as repressed conflicts. However, Freud's psychoanalytical approach, digging into childhood trauma, often made OCD worse, as the disorder feeds on analysis and rumination. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the advent of the serotonin hypothesis and behavioral therapy, that effective treatments emerged. The gold standard for treatment today is exposure and response prevention, ERP. It is counterintuitive and frankly terrifying. It requires the patient to voluntarily expose themselves to their greatest fear and then refuse to perform the ritual. A person with contamination fears might be asked to touch a toilet seat and then sit with the anxiety without washing their hands. A person with harm OCD might be asked to hold a knife while standing near a loved one. The goal is habituation, teaching the brain that the anxiety will eventually peak and subside on its own, and that the catastrophic outcome will not occur. It is a process of rewiring the brain through courage. Pharmacologically, high doses of SSRIs, often double or triple the dose used for depression, are used to increase serotonin availability in the synaptic cleft, helping to grease the sticky gears of the CSTST loop. For the most severe treatment-refractory cases, where the patient is housebound or suicidal, modern medicine turns to neurosurgery. Gamma knife capsulotomy involves using focused radiation to create precise lesions in the brain circuits that drive the OCD loop. Alternatively, deep brain stimulation, DBS, involves implanting electrodes into the brain to regulate the abnormal impulses, a pacemaker for the obsessive mind. These desperate measures highlight the severity of the disorder. Patients are willing to undergo brain surgery to silence the noise.
Culturally, OCD represents the dark side of the human need for certainty. We live in a universe governed by chaos and entropy, yet the human mind craves order. OCD is the pathological intolerance of uncertainty. The sufferer demands a 100% guarantee that they won't get sick, that they won't hurt someone, that the house won't burn down. Since the universe cannot provide this guarantee, the sufferer tries to manufacture it through rituals. In this sense, OCD is a philosophical crisis played out on a biological stage. It raises profound questions about free will. If a person knows a ritual is senseless, but is physically compelled to do it,
who is in charge? The self or the circuit? The impact of OCD extends to the family unit, creating a dynamic known as family accommodation. Loved ones, hating to see the sufferer in distress, often participate in the rituals, opening doors for them, buying excessive soap, or offering reassurance, "No, you didn't hit anyone with the car." While done out of love, this accommodation fuels the disorder, validating the fear. Treatment often involves retraining the entire family to stop accommodating, a painful process of tough love necessary to break the cycle. As we look to the future, the rise of PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections, suggests that some cases of sudden onset OCD in children may be autoimmune, the body attacking the basal ganglia after a strep infection. This opens a new frontier where psychiatry meets immunology. Until a cure is found, millions of Americans continue to fight a silent, invisible war, navigating a world rigged with triggers, knowing that the monster they fear most is living inside their own skull.
Eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, the hunger of the void. Eating disorders are the deadliest of all mental health conditions. This is a statistic that bears repeating. Anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness, surpassing depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. These are not lifestyle choices, nor are they merely manifestations of vanity or a desire to look like a magazine cover. They are complex biopsychosocial malignancies that hijack the body's most fundamental survival instinct, the drive to eat, and invert it. In the United States, where abundance meets a culture of obsessive self-optimization, eating disorders have reached epidemic proportions, affecting at least 9% of the population worldwide and nearly 30 million Americans in their lifetime. They are wars waged on the battleground of the flesh, where the weapon is food and the casualty is the self. To understand the grip of these disorders, one must look at the spectrum. Anorexia nervosa is characterized by the relentless pursuit of thinness, a distorted body image, and the restriction of energy intake leading to significantly low body weight. But physically, it is a slow suicide. The body, denied fuel, begins to cannibalize itself. The heart muscle shrinks, leading to bradycardia, dangerously slow heart rate, and the risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Bones become brittle, osteoporosis, as the body leaches calcium to keep the heart beating. The body grows a fine layer of downy hair called lanugo in a desperate attempt to keep warm. The brain, starved of glucose, shrinks, cerebral atrophy. Psychologically, the sufferer is governed by the anorexic voice, a cruel internal dictator that equates starvation with purity, control, and superiority. Bulimia nervosa is the cycle of chaos. It involves recurrent episodes of binge eating, consuming large amounts of food in a short time while feeling a loss of control, followed by compensatory behaviors to prevent weight gain, such as self-induced vomiting, misuse of laxatives, or excessive exercise. While anorexia is often visible, bulimia is the secret disease. Sufferers are often of normal weight, hiding their torment behind a facade of normalcy. The physical toll is gruesome. Stomach acid from vomiting erodes tooth enamel and scars the esophagus. Electrolyte imbalances, particularly potassium depletion, can cause fatal heart arrhythmias. The salivary glands swell,
giving the face a chipmunk appearance. It is a violent assault on the digestive system, driven by a cycle of emotional numbness and overwhelming shame. Binge eating disorder, or BED, is the most common eating disorder in the United States, yet the most stigmatized and least understood. Unlike bulimia, there is no purging. It is pure, unadulterated loss of control. Sufferers consume massive quantities of food to numb emotional pain, triggering a flood of dopamine that temporarily soothes the nervous system, followed by crashing waves of guilt and self-loathing. In a society that equates fatness with moral failure, BED sufferers are often dismissed as gluttonous or lacking willpower, when in reality their brain's reward system has been hijacked in a manner similar to substance addiction. The neurobiology of eating disorders reveals that these are brain disorders, not just behavioral ones. Brain imaging studies suggest that in anorexia, the reward circuitry is inverted. For a neurotypical person, food releases dopamine, pleasure. For an anorexic, food may trigger anxiety, while starvation triggers a sense of calm or even euphoria. This is potentially an evolutionary adaptation gone wrong, the famine response. In ancient times, if a tribe was starving, those who could ignore hunger and remain active to hunt were the ones who survived. Anorexia may be the modern expression of this genetic trait.
Furthermore, the insula, the part of the brain responsible for interoception, sensing the internal state of the body, is dysfunctional. The sufferer literally cannot feel their body correctly. They may look in a mirror and genuinely see a distorted, larger version of themselves. The cultural ecosystem of the United States acts as a massive incubator for these pathologies. We exist in a schizophrenic food culture. On one hand, we are bombarded with hyper-palatable processed foods engineered to be addictive. On the other, we are inundated with the thin ideal and diet culture. The rise of wellness culture has birthed a new unofficial orthopraxy, orthorexia nervosa. This is an obsession with clean or healthy eating that becomes so rigid it damages physical and social health. It masks the disorder in the language of virtue. I'm not anorexic, I'm just cutting out gluten, dairy, sugar, and cooked foods for my health. Social media platforms, particularly Instagram and TikTok, have accelerated this contagion.
The pro-Anna underground communities provide thinspiration and tips on how to hide starvation from doctors and parents, gamifying the destruction of the body. Historically, the understanding of eating disorders has shifted from the spiritual to the secular. In the medieval period, holy anorexia, anorexia mirabilis, was seen in female saints who starved themselves to grow closer to God, rejecting the flesh to elevate the spirit. In the Victorian era, it became a nervous consumption. The modern clinical definition solidified in the mid-20th century, but for decades it was blamed on controlling mothers and family dynamics. Today, we know that genetics account for 50 to 80% of the risk. You load the gun with genetics and the environment pulls the trigger. A critical and overlooked demographic in this crisis is men. For decades, eating disorders were framed as a woman's issue. This gender bias has left millions of men undiagnosed. In men, the disorder often manifests as muscle dysmorphia or bigorexia. This is the obsessive belief that one is too small or not muscular enough. It drives dangerous behaviors like excessive weightlifting, rigid high-protein diets, and the abuse of anabolic steroids. The cultural pressure on men to look like Marvel superheroes has created a crisis of body image that rivals the pressure on women to be thin. Because it looks like fitness, it is often applauded rather than treated. Treatment for eating disorders is a brutal uphill battle because unlike alcoholism where you can abstain from the substance, you cannot abstain from food. You must engage with your drug 3 times a day. The most evidence-based treatment for adolescents is family-based treatment, or the Maudsley method. This approach rejects the idea of individual therapy initially, and instead deputizes the parents to take full control of the child's feeding. Food is medicine, and the parents are the nurses. The priority is weight restoration because a starved brain cannot process therapy. For adults, treatment involves a combination of nutritional rehabilitation, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, to manage the emotional dysregulation. However, the recovery rates are sobering. Only about 46% of anorexia patients fully recover, while 33% improve but retain symptoms, and 20% remain chronically ill. The condition can become severe and enduring anorexia nervosa, SEAN.
A state of chronic illness that lasts for decades. This has led to ethical debates about palliative care for anorexia. At what point do we stop force-feeding and allow a patient to die with dignity if the disease is deemed terminal? It is a controversial and heartbreaking frontier in medical ethics. The current landscape is being further complicated by the arrival of GLP-1 agonists, drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. While hailed as a cure for obesity, these potent appetite suppressants are a potential trigger for those with a history of restrictive eating disorders. They are changing the societal definition of willpower and reinforcing the idea that thinness is a pharmaceutical imperative. We are entering an era where the body is viewed as a customizable avatar subject to chemical editing. Ultimately, eating disorders are a rejection of the human need. They are an attempt to transcend the messy, needy, hungry reality of being a biological organism. In a world that feels out of control, economically, politically, environmentally, the eating disorder offers a seductive, microscopic kingdom of absolute control. I can determine the shape of my bones. It is a tragic, solitary sovereignty. Recovery requires the terrifying act of surrender, surrendering the control, surrendering the ideal image, and accepting the body not as a project to be finished, but as a vessel to be lived in. Until the culture shifts to value the function of the body over its form, the hunger of the void will continue to consume the best and brightest among us.
Substance use disorder, alcohol or drug addiction, the hijacking of the human will. Substance use disorder, SUD, is the great American shadow. It is a pathology that exists at the violent intersection of biology, commerce, and despair. In the United States, a nation founded on the principles of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, addiction represents the ultimate paradox, the enslavement of the self and the desperate pursuit of relief. It is not, as moralists once claimed, a failure of character or a defect of the soul. It is a chronic, relapsing disease of the brain's reward system, a biological coup d'etat where the survival instincts are usurped by an external chemical agent. Whether the substance is alcohol, opioids, methamphetamine, or cocaine, the endgame is a singular, devastating reality, the loss of the freedom to choose. With over 46 million Americans meeting the criteria for a substance use disorder in a given year, this is not a marginal issue. It is a systemic crisis that is hollowing out the workforce, shattering families, and reducing life expectancy in the richest country on earth. To comprehend the mechanics of addiction, one must descend into the mesolimbic dopamine system, the ancient reward pathway of the brain. Evolved over millions of years, this circuit was designed to reinforce behaviors essential for survival: eating, procreating, and social bonding. When a human engages in these activities, the ventral tegmental area, VTA, releases a precise dose of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, creating a sensation of pleasure and a memory log that says, "Do this again, it is good for survival." Drugs of abuse hack this system with terrifying efficiency. They do not merely stimulate dopamine release, they flood the system with a tidal wave, often releasing 2 to 10 times the amount of natural rewards. A hit of crystal methamphetamine, for instance, creates a dopamine surge so powerful that it physically rewires the brain's priority hierarchy. The drug stops being something the person wants and becomes something the brain believes it needs to survive, ranking it above food, water, and the safety of one's own children. Over time, the brain attempts to regain homeostasis by downregulating its dopamine receptors. This is the phenomenon of tolerance. The user no longer takes the drug to get high, they take it simply to feel normal, to escape the crushing dysphoria of a dopamine-starved brain. Simultaneously,
The prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, logic, and impulse control, begins to erode. This is the hypofrontality of addiction. The brakes of the brain fail just as the engine revs out of control. This explains the baffling behavior of the addict, the intelligent, loving person who steals from their parents or drives drunk despite knowing the consequences. They are not acting out of malice. They are operating with a broken decision-making apparatus, driven by a primal hunger that screams louder than reason. The landscape of American addiction is currently dominated by the opioid epidemic, a tragedy of iatrogenic, doctor-caused origin that has evolved into a massacre. This crisis did not begin in the back alleys. It began in the boardrooms of pharmaceutical giants like Purdue Pharma. In the late 1990s, a narrative was constructed that pain was the fifth vital sign and that new opioids like OxyContin were non-addictive. This marketing lie unleashed a flood of pills into the Rust Belt in Appalachia, regions already decimated by deindustrialization. When the government finally cracked down on prescriptions, the addicted population did not stop. They migrated to the cheaper, more potent street alternative, heroin. Today, we are in the third and deadliest wave, the era of illicit fentanyl. This synthetic opioid is 50 times more potent than heroin. It is being pressed into counterfeit pills and mixed into other drugs, turning every street purchase into a game of Russian roulette. The result is over 100,000 overdose deaths annually, a casualty count equivalent to a jetliner crashing every single day. However, while opioids garner the headlines, alcohol use disorder, AUD, remains the invisible giant, the most pervasive and socially entrenched addiction in the nation. Alcohol is the lubricant of American social life, celebrated in advertising and integrated into every celebration. Yet, it kills more people annually than all opioids combined, through liver disease, accidents, and violence. The cultural normalization of alcohol makes it uniquely insidious. The line between social drinker and alcoholic is often blurred until the physical dependence sets in. The tremors, the seizures, the delirium tremens. Alcohol is one of the few drugs from which withdrawal can be fatal, a fact that traps millions in a cycle of drinking to stave off the terrifying physical collapse of abstinence.
The history of America's relationship with substances is a pendulum swinging between excess and prohibition, from the gin craze of the colonies to the temperance movement that birthed the disastrous experiment of prohibition in the 1920s. The U.S. has struggled to find a middle ground. In the late 20th century, the war on drugs declared by President Nixon and escalated by President Reagan framed addiction as a criminal issue. This policy resulted in the mass incarceration of millions, disproportionately Black and Latino men, for nonviolent offenses. It treated a public health crisis with handcuffs and cages. The disparity is stark. During the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the response was militarized policing. During the current opioid epidemic, affecting largely white demographics, the response has shifted toward compassion and treatment. This racial double standard remains a deep scar on the American psyche. The sociological catalyst for the current explosion of SUD is often described as the void. Dr. Gabor Mate, a leading expert on addiction, argues that we should not ask why the addiction, but why the pain. Addiction is almost always an attempt to self-medicate trauma, whether it is the acute trauma of abuse or the chronic trauma of isolation and economic hopelessness. Economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton coined the term deaths of despair to describe the rising mortality among working-class Americans due to suicide, liver disease, and overdose. In a society that has eroded community structures, unions, and religious affiliation, drugs offer a synthetic connection, a chemical hug in a cold world. The rat park experiment of the 1970s famously showed that rats in isolation consumed morphine until they died, while rats in a social park with toys and other rats largely ignored the drug. The implication is profound. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Treatment for SUD is currently undergoing a paradigm shift. For decades, the dominant model was the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous, based on spiritual principles and total abstinence. While effective for many, its success rates are variable.
Modern medicine advocates for medication-assisted treatment, MAT. Drugs like methadone, buprenorphine, Suboxone, and naltrexone help to stabilize brain chemistry, reducing cravings and blocking the euphoric effects of opioids and alcohol.
This harm reduction approach, which includes needle exchange programs and safe consumption sites, is controversial. Critics argue it enables drug use. Proponents argue it keeps people alive long enough for them to recover. The data overwhelmingly supports the latter. Dead people cannot recover. A terrifying new frontier is the rise of polysubstance use. The drug supply is becoming a toxic soup. Xylazine, a veterinary tranquilizer known as Tranq, is now being found in fentanyl supplies. It causes necrotic skin ulcers that can lead to amputation and is resistant to Narcan, the overdose reversal drug. This complicates treatment massively, as physicians are now fighting a multi-front chemical war within a single patient's body. Ultimately, substance use disorder challenges the American myth of the self-made man. It reveals the fragility of human agency. It forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that biology can override will, and that in a consumerist society designed to trigger dopamine, we are all vulnerable. The path forward requires a dismantling of the stigma that views the addict as a pariah. It demands a healthcare infrastructure that treats addiction with the same urgency and compassion as cancer, and a societal reconstruction that addresses the root causes of the pain that drives the needle into the vein.
10. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders, the fractured reality. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders represent the most profound and unsettling frontier of the human mind. If other mental illnesses distort the way we feel, schizophrenia distorts the way we know. It is a shattering of the cognitive mirror, a disorder that fundamentally alters the perception of reality, dismantling the seamless continuity of self and world that the rest of us take for granted. Affecting approximately 1% of the population, or about 3.5 million Americans, it is less common than depression or anxiety, but its impact is seismic. It consumes the individual, devastates the family, and taxes the social safety net more heavily than almost any other condition. To witness untreated schizophrenia is to witness a human being trapped in a waking dream, navigating a labyrinth in sensory inputs and beliefs that no one else can see or hear. The symptomatology of schizophrenia is often misunderstood, reduced by Hollywood to the trope of the split personality, which is actually dissociative identity disorder, a completely separate entity. Clinically, the symptoms are divided into 3 categories: positive, negative, and cognitive. Positive symptoms are those that are added to the psyche, phenomena that should not be there. This includes hallucinations, most commonly auditory, hearing voices, which can range from benign whispers to screaming, abusive commands. It includes delusions, fixed false beliefs held with absolute conviction despite contradictory evidence. A sufferer might believe the FBI is broadcasting their thoughts, thought broadcasting, that they are a messianic figure, or that their organs have been replaced by machinery. These aren't metaphors to the patient, they are as real as the floor beneath their feet. Negative symptoms are those that are subtracted from the person, functions that should be there but are lost. This includes the flattening of affect, a lack of emotional expression, alogia, poverty of speech, and avolition, a total lack of motivation to perform self-directed activities. These symptoms are often the most debilitating and the hardest to treat. They are what leave many sufferers unable to work, bathe, or socialize, creating the appearance of laziness to the untrained eye. Cognitive symptoms involve the disintegration of executive function, the inability to focus, to remember, to organize thoughts. This is often described as a formal thought disorder.
Manifesting in speech that is disjointed, tangential, or a word salad of unintelligible associations. The neurobiology of schizophrenia is a puzzle with many missing pieces, but the picture is becoming clearer. The dominant theory for decades was the dopamine hypothesis, the idea that the brain is flooded with excess dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway, causing the positive symptoms, hallucinations. This explains why antipsychotic medications, which block dopamine receptors, are effective at quieting the voices. However, modern research also points to the glutamate hypothesis, involving dysfunction in the NMDA receptors and the neurotransmitter glutamate, which may account for the negative and cognitive symptoms. Structurally, the brains of chronic schizophrenia patients often show enlarged ventricles, fluid-filled spaces, and a reduction in gray matter volume. There is a terrifying process known as synaptic pruning that goes awry. During adolescence, the brain naturally prunes unnecessary neural connections to become more efficient. In schizophrenia, this pruning may become aggressive and excessive, literally stripping away the neural infrastructure of the mind. This explains why the onset typically occurs in late adolescence or early adulthood, the very moment the brain is finishing its construction. The etiology of the disorder is a complex interplay of the 2-hit hypothesis. The first hit is genetic vulnerability. Schizophrenia is highly heritable. If an identical twin has it, the other has a 50% chance of developing it. However, genes are not destiny. The second hit is environmental: viral infections in utero, birth complications, hypoxia, childhood trauma, or drug use. The relationship between high-potency cannabis, THC, and schizophrenia is a subject of intense scrutiny. Evidence suggests that in genetically vulnerable adolescents, heavy marijuana use can accelerate the onset of psychosis and worsen the prognosis, acting as a chemical key that unlocks a door that might have otherwise stayed shut. The history of schizophrenia is a grim chronicle of humanity's fear of the other. In the early 20th century, sufferers were warehoused in massive state asylums, subjected to barbaric treatments like insulin shock therapy and transorbital lobotomies, procedures that destroyed the personality to tame the behavior. The mid-century introduction of Thorazine, the first antipsychotic, was hailed as a miracle, emptying the asylums.
This led to the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 70s, codified by the Community Mental Health Act. The intention was noble, to treat patients in their communities. The execution was a catastrophic failure. The funding for community centers never materialized. As a result, hundreds of thousands of patients were discharged onto the streets with a bottle of pills and no support. This failure birthed the modern crisis, where the largest providers of mental health care in the United States are not hospitals, but jails. The Los Angeles County Jail, Cook County Jail, and Rikers Island hold more people with serious mental illness than any psychiatric facility. This is the criminalization of mental illness. Sufferers, often homeless and unmedicated, are arrested for minor offenses, trespassing, loitering, driven by their psychosis. Once incarcerated, their condition deteriorates in the stressful, predatory environment of prison. It is a revolving door of misery. Furthermore, the stigma of violence hangs heavy over the diagnosis. While untreated psychosis can lead to violence, statistics show that individuals with schizophrenia are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. They are vulnerable prey in a ruthless world. A particularly cruel feature of the disorder is anosognosia, a neurological inability to recognize that one is ill. This is not denial, it is damage to the part of the brain responsible for self-reflection. The patient genuinely believes their delusions are real and that the doctors are the ones who are part of the conspiracy. This makes medication compliance the single biggest hurdle in treatment. Why would you take a pill that dulls your mind for a disease you don't believe you have? This leads to the legal and ethical quagmire of assisted outpatient treatment, AOT, and involuntary commitment. How does a free society balance the civil liberties of the individual with the need to protect them from a brain that is trying to destroy them? Treatment is a lifelong battle. First-generation antipsychotics, typical, cause severe motor side effects like tardive dyskinesia, permanent involuntary twitching. Second-generation atypical antipsychotics are better tolerated but carry risks of massive weight gain and diabetes, reducing the lifespan of patients who already die 15 to 20 years younger than the average American. Clozapine remains the most effective drug for treatment-resistant schizophrenia.
But it requires rigorous blood monitoring due to the risk of immune system suppression. Beyond pills, the recovery model emphasizes psychosocial rehabilitation, supported employment, housing-first initiatives, and cognitive remediation therapy to retrain the brain. The future of schizophrenia research is pivoting toward early intervention. The prodromal phase is a period of months or years before the first psychotic break, characterized by subtle withdrawal and suspicion. If we can identify and treat the brain during this window, perhaps with anti-inflammatory drugs or milder interventions, we might be able to prevent the psychotic break that causes the initial brain damage. Researchers are hunting for biomarkers in the blood or eye movements that could serve as an early warning system. Ultimately, schizophrenia spectrum disorders force us to confront the fragility of the self. We define ourselves by our thoughts, our memories, our perception of the world. Schizophrenia strips these away, leaving a person adrift in a terrifying, lonely cosmos. The challenge for the United States is to stop looking away. We see the sufferers on our street corners, shouting at invisible enemies, and we avert our gaze. To address this crisis requires a massive reinvestment in the social contract, providing housing, long-term care, and a legal framework that prioritizes healing over punishment. It requires us to extend our empathy into the realm of the incomprehensible, to recognize the humanity surviving beneath the fractured surface of the mind.